Hello, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to Daoism following the Way, a presentation for Pitkin County Senior Services. My name is Thomas DeZosh, and I will be your lecturer for our discussion today. To begin our discussion of Daoism, we can start with the historical founder, or at least the person who is attributed with the founding of Daoism. His name was Laozi. His dates are 6th century to 4th century BCE, and this date range is quite large because, frankly, we just aren't really sure what Laozi's dates might have been. It's possible that he was not even a real person. Some scholars have suggested that perhaps Laozi is a combination of a few different people. Nevertheless, within the Chinese historic narrative, Laozi was a real person, and his dates could have been anywhere between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE. Laozi just means old master, and that really is the only description of him that we have, that he was an aged individual with great wisdom who wrote down the teachings that are now known as the Tao Te Ching. The general understanding of who he was is that he was a government official at some point, and that he grew tired of looking around and seeing not only social unrest, but also a decline in the moral integrity of the people in the government where he was working. He finally became so fed up with his surroundings that he decided to leave. So he left China and traveled to the West. Little is known about him after he left China. Once he departed through the western borders of what was then China, he disappeared from history. The story goes that having become disgusted with the corruption and decadence of the government, he started traveling west, and when he reached the border, he was leaving through a guard post, and one of the guards stationed there recognized him and said, "Wait, before you leave, please give me your wisdom." And so Laozi stopped and started teaching this guard. And the guard wrote down everything that Laozi told him. And that was all collected in the text that is now known as the Tao Te Ching. Sometimes it's said that he was born old, that Laozi was never a child. He was always an aged person. In fact, if you look at the Chinese characters that make up his name, Laozi, another way that you can read it would mean old child. So this notion that he was born an aged person is part of the myth of Laozi. A central concept within the Tao Te Ching, which Laozi taught, is balance. And we might wonder what needs to be balanced. The first answer is that yin and yang need to be balanced. What we find expressed in the Tao Te Ching and in later Taoist texts as well is that the universe is comprised of many, many forces, but that when we look at those forces, whether we see it as being things that exist in opposition, or we could even think about the forces that create the universe as being the five elements. What we find is that no matter what we think comprises the world, the universe, everything comes from these two primordial energies, qualities of yin and yang. That's what we find expressed in the Tao Te Ching, is that all things are a combination of yin and yang in different proportions, and that those combinations of yin and yang are constantly seeking to find balance with one another. In the image that you see here of yin and yang, which you're probably familiar with, you see two halves of a circle. Part is dark and part is light. Now each half looks like a comma or like a paisley. And this is actually because the image is depicting movement. Those are swirling around one another. So when you see the image of yin and yang, you see that yin and yang are always in movement with one another, an eternal dance looking for balance. And in each side, in the light side, there is a dot of the dark. In the dark side, there is a dot of the light. And this indicates that these two things are really not opposites. They're complementary to one another. And so yang is often associated with light, with masculine energy, with warmth, with fire, with heaven, or what is called tian, which means order. Yang is the active energy, so it's associated with movement. It's associated with the intellect and with logic. And it's associated with being awake, your waking life. As a complement to all of those qualities, yin is associated with darkness, with feminine qualities, with coolness, with water, with the earth, with chaos, with passivity and stillness. It's associated with intuition and with the sleeping state, and also, therefore, with dreaming. It's important in seeing yin and yang that we understand that they're not seeking to overpower one another. Their ideal state is to reach a state of equilibrium. But all things are comprised of different amounts of yin and yang, and therefore they're always seeking to find balance with one another. And we could see that quest for balance, that desire or pursuit of balance, as being one of the ways in which the practice of Daoism really shows up in the way that it's lived in the world. Now, you may have already listened to the lecture on Confucianism. Daoism looks around and sees the world, and it says that there is social chaos. This is the same problem that we identified in our discussion of Confucianism. Both Daoism and Confucianism look at the world and they see the same problem. There is social unrest, social chaos. Daoism argues that one of the problems that leads to this social chaos is that human beings don't behave in a natural fashion. Human beings are so busy engaging in the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of social status. We're busy building societies and governments and things like that. Daoism says all of those things which we teach ourselves are really the heart of the problem. If we look around at the natural world, we don't see hierarchy. We don't see large governments where corruption can flourish. We see small groups of animals, perhaps, just little families of animals, parent animals and their offspring. We see animals doing what animals need to do to survive. They don't congregate in large societies. They don't build infrastructure, they don't build bureaucracies. Um, they just interact with the seasons and with the environment in which they live, and they find a way to be healthy and to survive in that space. Taoism says that that is a better teacher. That's a better thing to educate yourself about than bureaucracy and, the structures of government and filial piety. All of those things, Taoism says, are human constructs that actually take us away from the natural world. In chapter 20, we're told, give up learning and put an end to your troubles. Now, in this verse, Lao Tzu is not really suggesting that people shouldn't learn to read or that education in and of itself is a bad thing. People should pursue the things about which they feel passionately. But what he is saying here is that if you think that making yourself fit into a mold, because at this point in China, there's this desire for, advancement through government jobs and things like that. And this is one of the things Lao Tzu is really reacting to is, if you think that learning to fit into that constructed model of society is going to make you happy, you're wrong. You're better off looking to the natural world. There's true happiness to be found there. In chapter 18, he says, when wisdom and intelligence are born, the great pretense begins. Again, here, he's talking about a very particular kind of intelligence, a very particular kind of learning. And it's the kind of learning that leads to complicated government structures, that leads to large cities where thousands of people are living and trying to compete with one another for resources and compete with one another for influence. These are the things Lao Tzu is pushing against. He says that when human beings congregate in this way, when we try to build these large societies, we are opening the door to all of our worst qualities. Finally, in chapter 48, he says, in the pursuit of learning, something is acquired every day. In the pursuit of the Tao, every day something is relinquished. The world is governed by letting things take their course. It cannot be governed through interference. Here, Lao Tzu is again pointing to the reality that the world has a natural order that it follows. And when human beings attempt to subvert that order, problems will arise. Now, in that last verse or chapter from the Tao Te Ching, we heard the comment that in the pursuit of the Tao, every day something is relinquished. So what is the Tao exactly? Most commonly, this word is translated as the way or the path. We could think of it as the natural order of the universe. It governs all things. It is also the source of all things. And really, it is beyond any kind of description. In the very first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, we are told the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of the 10,000 things. Ever desireless, one can see the mystery. Ever desiring, one can see the manifestations. These two spring from the same source, but differ in name. This appears as darkness, darkness within darkness, the gate to all mystery. So, in the first part of chapter 1, we're told the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. So, here we get right off the bat the idea that the Tao itself is beyond human comprehension. We can't talk about it, we can't label it. There's really no way for us to explain what the Tao is. But then we're told that the named is the mother of 10,000 things. To understand this better, we can jump ahead to chapter 42. In chapter 42, we are told, the Tao begot one, one begot two, two begot three, and three begot the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things carry yin and embrace yang. They achieve harmony by combining these forces. So, first we have the Tao, that which is limitless, unnamed, unnameable. And that Tao begot one. And that one is the named Tao, which we hear reference to in chapter 1. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. So the named Tao begot two. I'm back in chapter 42 now. The two are yin and yang. So from the nameless Tao comes the Tao that is named. From the Tao that is named and conceived of come yin and yang. Two begot three. So from yin and yang came three. And those three things are heaven, earth, and humanity. That's one way we could understand the three. Those three could also be past, present, and future, so the three understandings of time. Those three could also be the three qualities of what are called the three treasures of Daoism: compassion, frugality, and humility. Kind of three virtues that define goodness, if you will. From the three came the 10,000 things, and that mirrors what we heard in chapter 1. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. The 10,000 things refers to just the world. You, me, rocks, trees, fish, birds, everything. Those are the 10,000 things. So in 42, we get a very clear understanding of the way in which the limitless, the nameless truth of the universe gave birth to something that we can begin to understand, or at least conceptualize. And from that unity came yin and yang as primordial forces. Out of yin and yang, doing their constant dance of balance, emerged the three, which are these three virtues of compassion, frugality, and humility, and also the three solid objects, or the three material things of heaven, earth, and humanity. And then from heaven, earth, and humanity emerges the entire world, all the 10,000 things. Now, another concept that you'll hear referenced throughout the text of the Tao Te Ching is De. And De most often is translated as virtue. We could think of it as ethics or morality. We could simplify it and say that it's kindness. Certainly those three treasures of Taoism, compassion, frugality, and humility, would be expressions of De. And what we find is if you get a translation of the Tao Te Ching, which there are many, 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 many translations of the Tao Te Ching, about the first half of the Tao Te Ching is dedicated to discussions and descriptions of the Tao itself. And the second half of the text really deals with how to live out that path or that way. And living out the Tao is to express day, or we might think of day as Tao in action. Another concept that we see show up in the Tao Te Ching in many places is the idea of qi. We could think of qi as kind of the energy that's created by the world. That means it's also created by human beings and by natural objects and other living creatures. Um, it's very similar in many ways to the idea of the Force in the Star Wars movies. In Star Wars Episode 4, Obi-Wan Kenobi tells Luke Skywalker that it's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. In that quote, Obi-Wan Kenobi is talking about the Force, but we could just as easily apply that same description to qi. Sometimes it's called bioelectricity because it's an energy field that actually modern science is attempting to measure in the human body. If you know anything about the Chinese practice of acupuncture, the needles in acupuncture are placed along lines in the body that are called meridians. And those lines are where Chinese medicine says qi moves through the body. So, what is the importance of qi? The importance of qi is that it supports our life. If your qi is strong, you're healthy. If your qi is weak, you're sickly and tired all the time. And since Taoism seeks to enjoy life and to connect with the natural world, one of the ways in which that connection with the natural world is expressed is through the cultivation and strengthening of qi within the body. In many ways, Taoism, especially in its earliest expressions, isn't really interested in an afterlife, but it's very interested in prolonging this life. In some forms of Taoism over time in China, because again, we're thinking about a religion here that's 2,000 to 2,500 years old, there were times where there was a real focus within Taoist spirituality and religious practice where they focused on acquiring immortality. And the central way to acquire immortality was to strengthen the qi in the body and to prolong youth and vitality. So when we think about the ways in which Taoist practices, particularly practices that are focused on the cultivation of qi, still exist in the modern world, some of them are meditation practices, similar, not exactly the same, but similar to Buddhist meditation or Hindu meditation. But we also see the development in China of many martial arts. I'm thinking here of Tai Chi or Qigong, which are considered to be quote unquote soft martial arts, but also the development of more quote unquote hard martial arts like Kung Fu. All of these martial arts have in their foundation an awareness of how to cultivate and harness qi in the body to promote vitality and energy, strength, health, all of those things. And those martial arts practices, which again are still practiced today all over the world, really do have their root in early Taoist understandings of this energy of life, or qi. Another important text in looking at Taoism as a world wisdom tradition or as a Chinese religious tradition is the text called the Chuang Si. Now, the text takes its name from its author. Chuang Si lived 369 to 286 BCE. And he was a follower of Laozi. He was someone who subscribed to the views that were being taught by people who followed after Laozi and were reading the Tao Te Ching and other texts that were commentaries on the Tao Te Ching. The text of the Chuang Si has a little bit more magical or mystical quality than what we find in the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is mystical in its discussion of the Tao itself, but there's a lot of practical commentary in the Tao Te Ching, particularly in the second half, where it talks about how to live according to Day. The Chuang Si really is more interested in the magic of the natural world. We find references in the Chuang Si to magical creatures such as a giant bird whose wingspan is so wide that you cannot see from one wingtip to the other. And it lives above this giant lake over which it flies endlessly, never landing. So just a much more magical quality to the Chuang Si. And this text, the Chuang Si, really begins to dig more deeply into another Taoist concept called Wu Wei, which I will talk about in just a few minutes. Another major concept that's presented in the Chuang Si is the idea of the life of wandering. What we find is that as Taoism evolves, it sort of evolves in a direction that is opposite to that of Confucianism. Whereas Confucianism is seeking to see people living in community, building harmonious society, Taoism begins to advocate for a life of wandering in the mountains, engaging with the natural world, being kind of a free spirit in a lot of ways, communing with the wind and with trees, finding the will of the Tao. There are many interesting concepts that are presented in the Chuang Si, and I want to touch in on two stories in particular. The first story appears at the end of chapter 2, and it's commonly referred to as the butterfly dream. Once upon a time, I, Chuang Si, dreamt that I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither, to all intents and purposes, a butterfly. I was conscious only of my happiness as a butterfly, unaware that I was Chuang Si. Soon I awakened, and there I was, veritably myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a man. Between a man and a butterfly, there is necessarily a distinction. The transition is called the transformation of material things. Even though this story is quite short, it's one of my favorite parts of the text. I think because I just enjoy the question that's underneath this story, which to me is, how do we really know what is real. In this story, he says he dreamt he was a butterfly, and it seemed very real, and he was carefree. And then he woke up, and he was himself, and it seemed very real. But how does he know which one is really real? And I think this is illustrative of the character of this text. There's a sort of whimsical, magical way of thinking about the world that sees beauty and wonder in everything, and that isn't afraid to ask the question, what if this whole thing is a dream and I'm really a butterfly, asleep, dreaming that I'm a man? The other concept that I want to bring out clearly is this concept of wu wei. Most often it's translated as non-doing, but that can be misleading. Wu wei isn't just doing nothing. Rather, it is something similar to what we think of in the modern world as flow state. And a great example is found in the Chuang Si in the story of cook Ding. Prince Wenhui's cook was carving up an ox. Every touch of his hand, every heave of his shoulder, every step of his foot, every thrust of his knee, with the slicing and parting of the flesh and the zinging of the knife, all was in perfect rhythm, just like the dance of the Mulberry Grove, or a part of the Qing Shou Symphony. Prince Wenhui remarked, "How wonderfully you have mastered your art." The cook laid down his knife and said, "What your servant really cares for is the Tao, which goes beyond mere art. When I first began to cut up oxen, I saw nothing but oxen. After 3 years of practicing, I no longer saw the ox as a whole. I now work with my spirit, not with my eyes. My senses stop functioning, and my spirit takes over. I follow the natural grain, letting the knife find its way through the many hidden openings, taking advantage of what is there, never touching a ligament or tendon, much less a main joint. A good cook changes his knife once a year because he cuts, while a mediocre cook has to change his every month because he hacks. I've had this knife of mine for 19 years and have cut up thousands of oxen with it, and yet the edge is as if it were fresh from the grindstone. There are spaces between the joints. The blade of the knife has no thickness. That which has no thickness has plenty of room to pass through these spaces. Therefore, after 19 years, my blade is as sharp as ever. However, when I come to a difficulty, I size up the joint, look carefully, keep my eyes on what I am doing, and work slowly. Then, with a very slight movement of the knife, I cut the whole ox wide open. It falls apart like a clod of earth crumbling to the ground. I stand there with the knife in my hand, looking about me with a feeling of accomplishment and delight. Then I wipe the knife clean and put it away. "Well done," said the prince. "From the words of my cook, I have learned the secret of growth." In this story from the Chuang Si, we get a very clear understanding of what Wu Wei is actually about. Cook Ding never indicates that he is uneducated. In fact, he's very educated about his work. He's been doing it for a long time. He's developed great skill. But he has learned how to let go of trying to make something happen. He simply follows the natural flow of what he's doing. What he is doing is cutting up an ox. But he has learned how to step aside from his desire to control it. He simply allows the knife to follow the natural flow. Throughout the texts of Taoism, particularly the Tao Te Ching and the Chuang Si, we hear over and over again comparisons to water. Water is used as a metaphor for the way that the Tao moves, the way that a human being can become one with the Tao, because water follows the natural course. It seeks the easiest route. Water is patient. It doesn't try to burst through anything as a general rule. Of course, there are examples of water being quite destructive, but more often than not, water follows the course of least resistance and over time wears down a clear and simple path. All of this is an example of what is meant by Wu Wei, this notion of stepping into the current rather than fighting against the current. And it seems, as you dig more deeply into these texts, that what is at the heart of Taoism is letting go of our individual sense of what needs to happen or what we think is best, and turning over that control to the Tao, to the natural flow, to the world itself, so that we become participants in a larger flow rather than trying to always be in the driver's seat. And this is really at the heart of Taoism as a religious practice, finding a way to step into that flow of the natural world. Wherever you are, you might be stepping into the flow of the natural world in the middle of a very busy city, or you might be stepping into the natural flow on the side of a mountain, somewhere far away from civilization. Either way, finding what is natural, and I would even go so far as to say what is true in those moments, that is Wu Wei. It's also an expression of Dei, and it is finding unity with the Tao. And in Taoism, finding unity with the Tao makes a person a sage. They are essentially an enlightened person who has found freedom from fighting against the current of the world. And that really is, for many Taoists, the primary goal. As I mentioned, there are schools of Taoism that are focused on prolonging life, even to the point of immortality. But all of that really is in the service of having a long enough life that you can achieve the freedom that comes from becoming one with the Tao. This has been an introduction to Taoism, Following the Way, a presentation for Pitkin County Senior Services. My name is Thomas Dezash. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time.